Okay, everybody, we're going to charge on with a very interesting session on a proposed conservation fund, which is going to be chaired by Gavin Courtney of SATSA. And I just want to pay a huge word of thanks to Gavin and SATSA. They've been incredible supporters of SATSA. We don't have huge logistical support at head office, and they step into the breach time and time again to assist us with legal advice, with financial advice, and a whole lot of other stuff. And then can I just also just urge you as well, behind us here around the back are booths where our key sponsors have set stuff up. And please just take some time to go around and interact and speak to Zurich, speak to Vodacom and Bidvest Bank around the back here. We're going to spend 45 minutes on the session. I know the trains run on time in the Courtney household, so over to you, Gavin.
Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, Minister, thanks for your attention over the next 45 minutes. David, we're going to sadly break the PowerPoint drought that the conference has had thus far because there are a couple of key slides that we need to put up. Really, the purpose of the session, and bearing in mind the limited time that we have, is just to announce the initiative. It hasn't been completed. We're working towards a formal launch date, but it's just to really give you background as to the why, where we are, progress to date, etc. And then just give you an idea of some of the parties involved. I'd just like to quickly introduce our panelists. Many of them will be known to you. Craig Drysdale at the end there, Head of Global Sales at Thomson's. Thank you for stepping in for Linda at short notice. Martin, thank you again, very short notice for stepping in just to talk through some of the financial modelling and based on the research and work your firm have done thus far. Colin Bell, well-known conservationist and member of the South African Tourism Board, thank you. Mr. Glenn Phillips, Managing Executive of Kruger National Park, and Werner Myburg, the CEO of Peace Parks Foundation. Before I move on, just to give you a little bit of background in a very abbreviated form, back in December 2014, Colin Bell reached out to us and said that we really, as a tourism industry, need to be looking to be putting something back into conservation. The poaching problem with some of our key species is spreading through the continent and has reached South Africa. And effectively, without three of the big five, for example, we haven't got a tourism industry. People do come out to this part of the world to look at wild animals. Things progressed. We enrolled the assistance of Jan Hutton, who shares our passions and concerns. And then really early May, I think it was, Colin had an opportunity to meet with Werner Myburg from Peace Parks on something slightly unrelated. And when Werner understood what it is as an industry we potentially were trying to achieve, he took it back to his board and came back to us and said that the Peace Parks Foundation would very much like to be involved, which you'll see now takes this initiative to a far bigger scale, which is great because we haven't got the luxury of time. Werner will take you through the background to the Peace Parks Foundation, who they are, the very generous financial commitment they've made for the first 24 months. And I guess it boils down to the question, what drove us to kickstart this initiative? First and foremost, we certainly the working group and the people that were involved from the beginning are all committed conservationists, and like everybody else in this room, we all have a vested interest in the ongoing success of the tourism industry in this country. And we believe that is inextricably tied to the survival of key species. I'll just leave you with a couple of short points. Africa's lion population over the last 50 years has plummeted from around 500,000 wild lions to just over 25,000 today. The elephant population for the same period has gone from many millions down to around 400,000 today. An elephant is poached every 15 minutes and a rhino every 8 hours. So those are quite sobering stats. And if we don't do something to arrest that as an industry, we're gonna have a problem. The For the sake of a name, we're using Tourism Conservation Fund. It is, it's not final. We've had various proposals that we're busy considering in terms of a more relevant name, a logo, everything else. So without further ado, I'd just like to, at this juncture, introduce Werner and ask him just to take you through a bit of background to the Peace Parks Foundation for those of you who would not maybe be familiar.
Thanks, Gav. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity. This is not a death by PowerPoint, so it will really be quickly. But a lot of people do not know Peace Parks Foundation, and I think primarily because we don't really operate in South Africa. We mainly operate outside of the boundaries of South Africa, supporting governments. Governments are our primary clients, and we work in 10 countries in Southern Africa. And I think more behind the scenes as a partner to government than as a typical NGO role standing separate from government. And that's our DNA, and that's really was our DNA conceptualized by these three gentlemen on the screen behind me. Dr. Anton Rupert, I think he needs no introduction. His son Johan Rupert is now the chair of Peace Parks Foundation Chairman. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and of course Nelson Mandela. And they came up with an idea to say, how can we develop Africa in 50 years from now? What's Africa going to be like in 50 years from now? And they concluded that if we don't compete as a region against the rest of the world for tourism, which is the largest employer, I don't have to tell you that, we won't stand a chance to really feed the millions of poor people. So the initiative is about conservation, supporting, and sustaining development. Okay, so it's not a greenie, it's a developmental approach, it's a pragmatic approach. So what do? We support governments, we focus on conservation of biodiversity, so it's an ecosystems-based approach across international boundaries. I always mention the typical example in CASA, we've got a 5-country TFCA or Peace Park, and we always say to the ministers or the communities or to whoever we are consulting or engaging with, is it your elephant, or is it his elephant, or is it our elephant? And that's as simple as that. Nature knows no boundaries. And this idea is to have an ecosystems-based approach across international boundaries. And there's a slide of the current existing endorsed transfrontier conservation areas throughout Southern Africa. It spans over 1 million square kilometers. And those in red are endorsed at a level by heads of state. So treaties have been signed by those governments. They've committed themselves to cooperate across international boundaries and to develop this jointly as a tourism product to ensure seamless movement of tourists. Now, this is very, very difficult things to achieve. You know, it's not easy, but certainly there's political will. It is possible, and we've seen tremendous successes over the past few years. One thing I'd like to just highlight is that our role in all of this is a facilitator, and in many cases an implementer. And our biggest role to date, really in this concept, has been to help governments to manage their resources from international donor funding. So you'll see that the last point is we've mobilized over 3.7 billion rand in the past 18 years. And that 3.7 billion rand is primarily coming from development agencies, the World Bank, the German Development Bank, European Union, French Development Agency, etc. That's why you see these big figures to help conservation move forward. So we haven't spent all 3.7 billion rand. That's a figure that we've secured until 2022. But I think the important thing is to understand and realize that of that 3.7 billion, it's actually now close to 4 billion. We've mobilized over 2 billion rand in the last 5 years for conservation. So we know that even post 2008, there's an incredible goodwill, there's an incredible interest from the international community to see Africa moving forward and believing in tourism as one of the anchors. So I think maybe just do that. So that's just in a nutshell about Peace Parks. Obviously, we can answer questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Werner. Then I guess, you know, to move on to the next key point, and just to hear from different sector people, if you like, perspective as to why this is important. And I'd like to hand the mic over to Glenn Phillips from South African National Parks, just to give his view on the importance of and why we should be doing this and supporting this.
Firstly, I can understand from an industry perspective people saying, but hold on, this is government's role, they must fund conservation. And I want to right up front say that that's not going to happen in a country where we've got so much poverty, we've got education issues, we've got health issues that all require focus. Conservation works, conservation is we call it a black hole when it comes to money. You can never put enough money into conservation. From a SANParks perspective at the moment, our mandate is conservation, and our funding strategy is nature-based responsible tourism. And that is how we're funding it. Currently, of our operational budget, so not our public works funding that we get, that the Minister mentioned through working for water projects that help us with bush clearing around rivers, working on fire, helping with our fire regimes and that type of thing. We get that funding, but it's project-based. Our pure operational funding from a day-to-day basis makes up 17%, 17 of our operational costs. The rest comes from you and the tourists who come into the parks. Last year we generated about 1.2 billion rand out of from tourism to fund the conservation mandate, and about 50% of that was surplus, which goes straight back into conservation. But if we look at each park management plan and we cost it, we would need something like 10 to 15 billion to implement what we would like to do in every park. And that's just the challenge, and it's not us only. The US is currently coming to us to say, how are you doing this? Because their budgets are being cut. How are you funding conservation the way you are through tourism? Because we're not achieving it. So we've got a model that's working. But if we don't look after conservation, the model will fail. And we need everybody who impacts on conservation to help contribute to looking after it. That's what we're looking for. On the poaching side, we've heard yesterday the mention of the Big Five. The Big Five is what we know it's an old hunting term, actually. You hunted the Big Five, but it's become a tourism driver for the country. Come and see the Big Five. And imagine if it goes down to the Big Four. Now, I can tell you now that the rhino are not going to go extinct, despite what you hear in the media. Not in this country. They will not go extinct. And people fail to remember that in the 1960s, there was not one rhino in Kruger. Not one. And because they were all hunted out prior to that. And from 1965 onwards, they grew rhinos all the way up to the numbers of about 2,800 that we had a few years back before the poaching started. So there's no reason why they're going to go extinct. 20,000, up to 20,000 rhino that we had before the poaching started. So it shows it can be done. We've got to find, and there's no one solution. There's no panacea to this. And we've got to look at all the different options. And some of this conservation fund is not only going to be for conservation. It actually has to go to communities. Because if communities don't understand the value of conservation, we will lose it. And currently, they sit on the board of our parks and they look at it and they say, how are we benefiting from this? So it's very important that when we see conservation, we don't just see it as animals and grass and trees. It's an ecosystem that involves people. And we've got to manage it around that. Our current costs of operations just on the anti-poaching, and this is the big challenge we sit with, all our rangers currently just do anti-poaching. We're not doing conservation. That is a huge challenge for us. So we're working on a process now to try and separate the two, but we need every man on the ground at the moment. We've got close to 900 rangers working 3 shifts a day, sometimes 2 shifts a day that they have to do, 12 hours at a time, to be on the ground. That is tremendous pressure on people. And they are not able to, that affects their families, the communities they live in. It's a major issue for us. Last financial year, it cost us 90 million rand just for the Ranger Corps to run them. That's air support, it's the Rangers' salaries, the equipment, and all that. And this year we budgeted from our own budget 149 million for the Ranger Corps. However, that is not what it's really costing us, because we've also got the technology investments that are going in, where Howard Buffett Foundation is funding. We've got 2 new helicopters. We've got technology that's being implemented, a whole security system that's going to come in. We've got to do it very sensitively because we don't want the park to feel like a military base. So we've got to do that very carefully, but that's being implemented at the moment. We've got Peace Parks, who also from a technology funding side putting money in, about 68 million. Howard Buffett put in 255 million. We've got a situation is And we've got a strategy that we're working on right now. It's called post-Buffett. What do we do then when that money dries up? Okay, so we've got to find a source that's going to continue to help fund these things that are out of the norm. They're not what we would normally have to do. So a conservation fund that's being driven in a very responsible way in partnership with government. It does work. You heard about the self-regulation. It can work if we just put our heads together. And we believe it's something we really desperately need.
Thanks, Glenn. Then putting the same question to you, Craig, from an operator, private sector point of view, why Thomsons have kindly in principle agreed to support, and why you think it's vital.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. I think from a tourism perspective, and particularly from tour operators, we also want to be seen and not just taken out of conservation, but as by putting back in the responsible tourism thing. So from a marketing strategy, Thomson's is definitely, with this particular fund, would definitely endorse it going forward and putting it through the distribution channels to our end consumers and saying what we take out, we want to put back in. I think it's imperative. And I just think from a marketing point of view, we all go out as operators and sell this, what we call the Big Five. And as it was said yesterday, it's all about the safari. Imagine not having the animals. I mean, what do we sell? Is it Garden Route, Cape Town, Table Mountain? I don't know. The drive is the conservation, and it is one of our keys and jewels, and always has been in Southern Africa, particularly South Africa. So I think it's about time, and it's definitely from our side, we will definitely endorse this and go through this funding through, and obviously the mechanisms and the semantics and all that will be put together as we go forward. But I think it's imperative that the private sector, not all seen as taken from, but actually putting back. It won't affect businesses from a profitability, but it's moving back to the consumer. But it's this. We always talk about this responsible tourism thing, and I think. From our side, definitely we would endorse this going forward.
Thanks very much. Colin, would like to add from a conservationist perspective?
It's been interesting looking out across Africa and seeing different countries and how they react and how they interact between communities, government, private sector and wildlife. And some countries have huge successes and some countries are struggling. And I think South Africa is looking at this rhino story, but it's the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more coming. The elephants, syndicates and the militia on their way, etc. And I think in South Africa, the tourism industry is by and large operated in silos. So we've been an industry which is, lots of people have done lots of good, but it's been at small scale. And as a result, we're not recognized as an industry. If you look at what the government's done on the visa side of things, not really consulted us. Why? Because we actually are not part of the solution. We are largely an industry which makes cash out of tourism but does little at scale. And I stress at scale because a lot of people do individual things, but we do very little at scale. And it's about to really change the profile of how we react and to protect the industry on which the tourism industry depends. We have to come together at scale. And I believe if we do come together at scale, first of all, we'll get huge recognition from government. We won't have these decisions where we've been ignored. We will have an ability, we'll be at the table where we can make a meaningful contribution. And I think that if we come together at scale, all of us, with tiny little bits added to make a bigger contribution in a wonderful fund, we can, without impacting on our business models, we can really make a difference. And I was reading a newsletter from Kenya last night, where this one particular lodge, every guest pays $101 US over and above their bed night. So they pay something like $600 per person per night, plus $101, which goes to community conservation. I mean, that's nearly 1,400 Rand per person per night. And you think of the effect of that has throughout the region when lots of people are paying that kind of money. And we're not asking anything like that. We're talking about 0.5%. 0.5% voluntary contribution. And if everybody did this, we could raise potentially R500 million a year for conservation. And we're talking about Glen needing 68 million from peace parks to make sure that they can do their work. Can you imagine what R500 million can do to ensure that our industry has got some form of sustainability without changing our business model? And I think that's the most important thing. It's a voluntary contribution at the very end of what the whole invoice story. And I think if we don't do it, if we don't come together at scale, I think our industry is going to be under serious threat. And here we've got an opportunity to contribute to ensure that we have a future without costing us individually a cent.
Thanks, Colin. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm sure there's going to be questions from the floor. So just to move on, Werner, perhaps you can just take us through the proposed structure, which is the following slide. And this was really taken whilst this was a private sector initiative that was kick-started. Based on advice taken, it's vital that we have government involvement and government endorsement for many reasons, which Werner will take us through quickly now.
Thank you. Just the genesis of when Colin came to me and he said, we're thinking of a fund, I said to him, but without government you cannot move forward. And then he said, yeah, but if we have private sector and government, that's a recipe for an explosion, because how do we know that the money is going to be looked after properly? And I said, well, that's exactly where we came from when we started this type of arrangement, institutional arrangement, and don't worry too much about what's on the screen in terms of who and how. I mean, that's still a work in progress. But the point is that when we developed this with the German government and the Mozambique government, we developed a mechanism of partnerships to say, Peace Parks Foundation, you are appointed by the Mozambique government to look after the money of the German taxpayer, but the German taxpayer as a constituent, as a payer, sits on the board, the representative, the KfW, German Development Bank, as well as the government, as well as Peace Parks Foundation, and whoever else comes to the party. And through that structure, and we've run that structure, which is exactly what we propose for this fund, since 2001, we've never had an impasse on any decision being made. We've spent over 250 million rand in the past 5 years just in that specific fund, or that specific structure. We've never had a qualified audit. We've never had any corruption taking place. So the financial management mechanisms are sound, and this is according to the standards of KfW, which has been rated the world's safest bank for 3 years in a row, 2008, 9, and 10. So they are really serious players in terms of looking after their taxpayers' money. And it was done in a partnership with government and with private sector. So this structure is nothing different to that. And it's exactly that. And I think you alluded to that. What we need is we need innovation, we need partnerships, and we need to start doing things differently at scale. And this fund ticks all of those boxes. If we can have a partnership between government, NGOs, private sector, collectively deciding on how to spend the money transparently, every cent accounted for, we can do something at scale, and we can start making an impact. Remember, this type of funding is not encumbered by procurement processes within governments. So instead of running a full tender process, you can have a much more fast-tracked approach. So it still enables us to support whatever the board, the advisory board, decides to support, but in a much more efficient way, transparently, well communicated, and we focusing on the impact. But it is a work in progress. We've had experience. This will be the 4th one. If we succeed and if everybody is happy, government, private sector, NGOs, it will be the 4th similar structure that we've been involved with, and I know it works. And yes, you go through difficult periods, you go through good periods, but that's typical of any board. You get a good board and you get a bad board, and you get a terrible board. That's reality. So I don't think expect a rosy picture, but I know that if we do it this way, we'll have government as a critical endorser. Without government, you cannot move forward. By the way, 80% of all the rhino in South Africa is in government's hands. So if you don't want government involved, so good luck with protecting the 20% that's sitting in private sector hands. You know what I'm saying? It's your tourism product is in the government properties. So I think we can maybe address some of the questions afterwards, but this is just conceptual and based on our experience to date.
Thanks, Werner. We debated this point at length, and we believe that to get big the big players in tourism, the big players in general corporate South Africa, because tourism will kickstart this initiative, but it will not be the sole funder, if you like. We're going to go out into general corporate South Africa. For them to support, we believe it needs to be government endorsed. We also believe that when asking a tourist if they would like to make a donation at point of booking or checkout, we also believe that they would want to see that this initiative has got the approval and stamp of the South African government. So the byline will be government endorsed, private sector managed, and that's what we will roll out. Just moving on to the funding mechanisms. Now, bear in mind, Grant Thornton have presented an initial findings, opinions, and recommendations. It still needs to be mulled. There's more work to be done on it. So Martin will touch on some of the high-level research work that they've done in terms of the different avenues of potential funding. But without going into too much detail, because it's not, as I said, it's at conceptual stage right now still. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. I think the point is that when we looked at international best practice, is that there's a couple of key things that comes through. Is point number one, the contribution needs to be voluntary. Second of all, it needs to be simple to understand and simple to administer, and it needs to be private sector driven. So what we had to look at is in terms of various avenues to make it as easy as possible in order to contribute to the fund. And just took a couple of ideas in terms of initiatives. You might be familiar with the My School card system, where you go to your Woolworths and then a certain portion of that contribution goes to whoever you nominate. That is a contribution by Woolworths. What we're also saying is, surely it should be possible in order for a credit card company to, when you do any type of transaction, not just a tourism transaction, if you go buy tires, you then get asked, would you like to contribute 0.5% of that purchase to the fund? So we're looking at different kinds of avenues in terms of the funding mechanism, and we're asking it to be a voluntary contribution. It needs to be a conscious decision that I'm contributing to the fund. And that can come both from the private sector, the entities themselves, as well as from the tourist.
Great, thank you. Just while we're on the subject of funding, Werner, are you at liberty just to confirm the very generous commitment made by the Peace Parks Foundation board once the fund is established and in place for the first 24 months?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. I mean, you know, our founder chairman, Dr. Anton Rupert, had a famous saying in the office. He said, conservation without money is just a conversation. And it applies, it really applies. It's just a conversation. We don't want to have a conversation. We've offered, and bearing in mind governments say yes, everybody says yes to invest, and I call it an investment, 6 million rand, to start up the fund for the first 2 years. And that will probably be to appoint somebody to head the fund and probably a business development manager, and plus operations. And I'm convinced that if we do the good job in terms of selling this, and we've got your buy-in and support, you're the best marketers in the world in any case, in the tourism sector, we can get this fund launched and become a household brand. So that's where we aim to. We're willing to invest the seed money and see where it goes. Because, let's face it, we've got nothing to lose. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then just the final point before we open to the floor, just really to update you as to what has been achieved to date and what the next steps are. Colin, did you perhaps just take us through the status to date? Would you like me to do it? Okay, a meeting has been held with with Minister of Tourism, and I believe there's one planned for Department of Environmental Affairs. We've had a presentation from Grant Thornton on the different financial models that are available. We've had a presentation from Jan Hutton at Deloitte on the some proposed logos, branding, everything else, which is going to be key. We've had 3 or 4 working group meetings thus far, with another one planned shortly. And we are great and really happy to announce that SATSA will also come on board, officially endorsing endorsing this initiative once it's in place. In terms of the next steps, we've set ourselves a target launch date of 22nd of September, which is a World Rhino Day. We've got to conclude the selection process for the name and logo. We've got to obtain a SARS ruling on the VAT implications. We've got to finish the drawing up of a constitution, which is going to drive and govern this entity. And then we'll start approaching some of the large non-tourism companies in South Africa, which have already been identified. Remgro, obviously the Rupert family, and others. Credit card companies have also been approached, and we need to get them on board, so that'll commence. And then we need to tie up the loose ends in terms of a working group with government to get that process finalised. And as soon as the board is formed, a CEO process, sourcing of a CEO needs to start, which is going to be key. So that's really where we are. Thank you for your attention, and we've got 10 minutes now just to go through questions, which I'm sure there will be some.
I find it great that Colin is retired, so he can finally spend his life doing something useful. Well done, Colin. Obviously, we were involved as a business. It would be interesting to hear Craig's view on that one, in the establishment of the TOMSA levy in the beginning. And the collection of what we would like to see, and we support this process, obviously, I mean, it's logical, but in order to make it really meaningful and collect the R500 million that is collectible in this environment, it needs to be streamlined. I understand the voluntary principle of it, because otherwise it becomes like a tax. But what we would like to avoid, I guess, at the end of the day, is a invoice to our customer that looks like a Christmas tree, where from TOMSA levy and tourism levy and skills development levy and another levy, another levy, another levy. So I'm wondering if there's not an opportunity to roll all of these voluntary levies up into a singular collection mechanism, one. I think the second one is the multiplicator effect through tour operators in the TOMSA environment is highly diluted at the moment, because most tour operators, and I would think you the same, Craig, take a view that the tourism levy is collected at point of residence, or where the people stay at the hotel part, and tour operators per se largely charge the tourism levy on their own product, like scheduled tours or whatever the case might be, only. And I think through that process, a whole heap of your collection mechanism will get lost, because you work in a multi-channel environment. So I would love to hear Craig's view in particular, how in a multi-channel environment one can maximize that collection effort, and not let one's invoicing to customers look like a Christmas tree. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Greg, I'll hand the mic to you now to respond. But also, just to be clear, whilst we've looked at different funding mechanisms, those points that you've just raised are still standing points as to how do we deal with it, because it's a reality.
Sorry, if I could add one. CSO to K or CSI.
Perhaps between Craig and Martin, you can respond to some of those points.
I think, yeah, Martin, just go back. I mean, like I said, this is right in the beginning, and I think the structures and how it's going to be put together, and that still has to be debated and discussed and through. I think the point particularly we come from an industry saying that in principle we have to go forward, and I think we must do this from a responsible tourism, and how will still come and do it. I think that the structure is right. The structure is coming in place in that. And yes, from a distribution channel, the multi-channels, from schedules to FITs to all that, so it's going to be very, very tricky. Does it come through? Do we just raise a simple invoice and call it 0.5% of something? Do we do it through the establishments? Do we do it through that's still, so that is, as an operator, is still a bit of the grey area, but I do believe that once this is in place, there will be some mechanism that will be easier. And also remember that we have operators and wholesalers and the end customer who wants to be part of this process, because part of our marketing drive-in is this whole responsible drive coming through to Southern Africa and giving some type of contribution. Many operators around here run similar programs, Save the Rhino, Save this and that, where a lot of our customers are actually contributing in one way or the donation, somewhere where and are quite happy to do that and get a certificate and feel part of that. So we've done these there's lots of pockets of excellence, and I'm sure a lot of people can talk about this. So there's definitely a dire need and a drive and a hunger And not just international tourists, like I say, it's not going to cost us money, but even local South Africans. We talk about the visas and that. So it's not just coming from international, but from local people. The how will still come. And I hear where you're coming from, and from an operator we see that, but it'll come. And I think the how we'll see. Maybe.
And sorry, Martin, before you go, Martin, once we've got the model to a point, we would most definitely be consulting with the large players like yourself to make sure that what we've come up with is practical and feasible and everything else. Because at the end of the day, we want support of this initiative from the big players like Tourvest and Thompson's.
Hey,
right
he's
down-
co-opted onto the team already. You're in.
right down to the smaller, the B&Bs, the tour operators. Everybody must buy in and support really.
Yeah, the reason why I haven't said this is exactly how the funding mechanism is going to work, because we need to speak to the credit card companies and say, is this actually, and it's where the technicality comes in, is in terms of whether it's actually possible. The idea, we talk about scale. The idea is that the main source of funding and the main mechanism would be that when you have a credit card transaction, something would pop up and say, listen, would you be willing to donate 0.5% of that transaction to the fund? And it will give you an amount. And if you're spending 2,000 Rand at your accommodation, that amount is going to be very small in relation to what the total amount that you're spending. So we hope that would be an incentive in order to do that. What it also does then do is that money could then electronically be immediately into the bank account. So in terms of collections, it eases that administrative burden. And it also opens it up to South Africa as a whole, not just the tourism industry. And this is what we want to do. We don't just want the tourism industry in order to do it. But we haven't got the absolute yes, this is possible from the credit card companies. There's still some work to be done then. And also, we don't want to close off any other avenue in terms of if we pass a hat around here and people give us money, that should be another way in order to get money. Also, we want to get away in terms of from the word levy. I'm not a tax expert, but the tax experts that we've got in our dungeon at back at the office, they tell us that in terms of whether you call it a levy or whether you call it a voluntary donation, it makes a difference in terms of when you've got impacts like VAT and so forth. So in terms of it's a voluntary donation that we're asking somebody to make a conscious decision in terms of, I want to give.
Speaking to the inbound industry, though, the credit card transaction is going to be useless because the people pay overseas, so you need to find different mechanisms to get to that wallet.
Exactly. That's why it would be one of this, and given the amounts that we're looking at will probably be the main one, but it won't be the only one. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a multi-approach in terms of, and that's where the discussions are still going to be happening to the industry in terms of, okay, if we're not talking about in terms of credit card transaction, the other ways. But we want it to be simple, straightforward in terms of not to complicate the system in terms of, it's easy to understand in terms of what we're contributing, how much that amount is going to be, is it a percentage, and so on. So that's the idea.
Sorry, Glenn, you wanted to add?
I think one of the challenges we're facing at the moment is I think there's something like 60 registered fundraisers out there for rhino poaching at the moment. Okay, and we see it from a national parks perspective, virtually none of it. Okay, it doesn't come to the ground. So people are making money out of the whole rhino issue right now. And what we want to do is give industry something to say, this is the one that you should do. Because people want to. Your tourists want to contribute, they want to help. But they don't know how to do it because we're not providing the proper mechanism. So they're buying bangles and they're doing all these different things, but the money is just funding some individuals. So that's a big challenge, and I think this alleviates that for the industry specifically.
Gavin, can I just maybe make a comment quickly, which we haven't touched on, is that once we've got this fund going, the biggest question normally comes out is how much of the money which comes in actually gets spent at the end of the day, and what's your admin cost? And Peace Parks have been fabulous on this. I mean, they're phenomenal to come up so that we can fund the first 2 years to make sure we get the program up and running. But then onwards, they're saying that once this fund has got momentum, the total cost to run the fund will be around about 1%. So you can say that 99% of the money collected will actually go through to projects on the ground. And the projects will be determined by that board And remember, the tourism industry is a very big player on that board. So we can actually help determine issues which are coming up. For instance, like Brand Africa. I mean, should we be putting some money aside to go and bolster the branding of Africa around the world? But to have Peace Parks come on board, I think, is a game changer. First of all, to have the cash to be able to hire the very best people to run this fund, but then onwards to say we're going to run it for 1%. I mean, there's no other organization like that. And I think Peace Parks need to be thanked hugely.
Thanks, Colin. We've probably got time for one more question. I did see a hand up there. Oh, sorry. Apologies.
Hi, good morning. My name is Adri Kitshoff and I'm representing the Professional Hunters Association of South Africa. I just want to, yes, the Professional Hunters Association of South Africa. I just want to give our support to this. We have a similar fund that we have seen that if the operator will take the trouble of approaching the international client, there's nobody saying no to such a fund. We've got a non-profit company. We've been dealing over the past few years that we raise a voluntary, we request a voluntary conservation contribution of $10 per animal taken or hunted in South Africa. And we've seen the benefits there of going back into conservation. Glenn Phillips would know about that. That goes back, we have supported sandparks amongst others with anti-poaching. And all the message I want to say is we sincerely support this. We have seen that it can work if the operator would take the time to ask the international visitor for a contribution. Nobody says no to a fund like this.
Thank you. I think there was one up top.
I'm Glenn from Transfrontier Parks Destinations. Colin has often spoken about how important it is to involve communities in conservation. And I received a message yesterday from a person doing social work in a village called Benda Mutali, which is just outside of the Pafuri Gate to Kruger Park. And it says, I want to talk about a youth empowerment and leadership project. The bottom line is I'm wanting to avert a local youth group from potentially closing the Kruger Road in protest at not being given jobs. I see the word conservation, but I'm hoping that there will be a specific approach to also inclusion of communities around that.
Can I answer that? I think what we're saying right now, the biggest focus is rhinos right now. But this is a tourism fund. And while it's probably the most important right now, we look at rhinos. In the medium to long term, rhinos, we're going to solve the problem. We're going to sort that out. We're going to have much bigger challenges which are going to face the tourism industry. And we need to have the cash to handle all of those issues, be it Brand Africa, be it communities. We've talked about communities, a huge, huge issue. We need to be part of the process to transform the tourism industry to incorporate the communities at scale. And we see this thing, and this is why we have a board there. If you go back to that picture, we have NGOs, we have government, and we have tourism sector. They will decide where the cash has to go. We need to make sure we put the very best people onto that board, and that board's properly constituted, runs well, and that board must then decide how the funds are going to be spent. And I think that clearly at the back of our minds that the issue of wildlife underpins our industries, but what underpins our wildlife industry, it is our communities. So the board will determine how the money is going to be spent, and then the implementers will make sure it's spent accordingly.
Thanks, Colin. Ladies and gents, thanks for your time. We'll keep you updated as to progress via the SATSA channels. And really, I'm hoping in advance that you will all support this once we go live.
Can we ask what kind of support? Do you think we're going to get support or not?
Point?
Guys? Hey. A few more. Come on, there's some waivers. We'll come and visit you in your offices.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gavin. That was very ably facilitated. And thank you, Werner, for your very generous time and commitment.